Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to the second week of virtual classes. I hope that the first week went smoothly for this and for all of your other classes. Today, we are shifting gears from Thomas Hobbes to look at John Locke's theory of political authority. Like Hobbes, we're going to start with how Locke articulates the state of nature. We're going to be looking at how he conceives of the state of nature, what is human nature for Locke, how does he conceive of property? Because as we remember for Hobbes, there's no real property industry, anything like that in the state of nature. So how does that differ for Locke, and what implications might that have for his political theory? And finally, we're going to compare Locke's and Hobbes' account of human nature, and you're going to be doing that in your discussion posts following this lecture for this week. So I'm going to break this lecture up into three sections. The first one is going to be focusing on context, then I'll pause for a break. The second is going to focus on Locke's conception of the state of nature and the state of war. And the last third is going to focus on his discussion of slavery and property. So there'll be little breaks indicated at various points in the lecture. So to understand Locke's political writings and their context, we have to return to the state of the English crown after the Civil Wars. So as we remember from last week, the English Civil Wars actually ended with the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, with Charles II in 1661, who was basically invited by Parliament to retake the crown after the collapse of the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Charles II died without a direct heir. He did not have any issue. And so his brother, the Catholic James II, takes the throne in 1665. I'm concerned about this at first because his daughter, Mary II, who was going to be his heir, was a Protestant, and so people weren't too concerned with James kind of restoring Catholicism in England. This began to change when his second marriage bore a son, James Francis Edward, who became Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. James's mother was also Catholic, and this led to concern of creeping Catholicism. There's also a significant concern about James's actions to crack down on dissent and opposition, including within the Church of England and within Parliament, that alienated from the allies that he once had in both those institutions. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details here, but ultimately, Mary II, James's daughter from his first marriage, had a claim to the throne, and William and her husband, William of Orange, also had a distant claim as her cousin. And ultimately, they were more or less, with the support of Parliament, William led an army from Holland to invade the United Kingdom. It was a large enough army that James II was ultimately unable to risk fighting a losing battle, so he and his family fled to France, leaving the throne vacated. Now, in this time period, in December of 1688, William took over a provisional government and acted while a lot of the legal claims were trying to figure out what was going to happen with the king. And although the King James had fled the country, he still had many followers, and William feared that he might return, in which William would be relegated to the role of regent. And Parliament itself was also divided on what role should William have here. There were radical Whigs in the lower house that wanted to elect William as king, which would mean that his power would be derived from the people and not the divine right of kings. The moderates wanted an acclamation of William and Mary together, and the Tories, the more conservatives, wanted to make him regent or only acclaim Mary as queen, who had the direct claim to the throne. And so after significant politicking in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, William and Mary were installed as joint monarchs on April 11th, swearing an oath to uphold the laws made by Parliament. The Coronation Oath Act of 1688 provided a new coronation oath whereby the monarchs were to, quote, solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom of England and the dominions thereunto belonging, according to the statutes in Parliament agreed upon, and the laws and customs of the same. And so we're swearing to uphold the laws passed by Parliament and defend the people. They were not being installed as like the King of England here. They were they were installed as the King of England, but that power was mediated through Parliament. Additionally, the Bill of Rights was enacted in Parliament and the Bill of Rights of 1689 in December. And this listed 12 of James's policies by which James, quote, designed to endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of this kingdom. The Bill of Rights also asserted a series of ancient rights and liberties, including making it illegal to suspend or dispense with the acts of parliaments, levying money without the consent of Parliament would be made illegal, maintaining a standing army without the consent of Parliament would be illegal, the election of members of Parliament ought to be free, Parliament ought to have free speech and debate. These Bill of Rights, unlike the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, which apply to individuals vis-a-vis the government, these Bill of Rights were about the rights of Parliament, and they ultimately asserted that Parliament should have independent authority be over and against the monarch, and this really brings into effect the kind of constitutional monarchy system of government. So where does Locke fit into all of this? Before we get to Locke, I'm putting a couple of helpful sources if you're interested in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. There's a quick summary that helps kind of contextualize what's going on YouTube, a YouTube link to that, as well as a link to a longer documentary from the BBC that covers the ages of revolutions in England that kind of brings us from the English Civil War to the Revolution of 1688. So these will both be posted in Moodle underneath this mini lecture. So, turning to our friend Mr. Locke. Locke was born to Puritan parliamentarians in 1632. He died in 1700. His father was employed as a cavalry captain for the parliamentary forces in the English Civil War. As a child, he studied at the prestigious Westminster School in London, and he himself was never married and never had children. He received his formal education in Oxford, studying both medicine and philosophy. He was attracted more to the modern philosophy of René Descartes than the classical scholarship and studying the classics of Plato and Aristotle and Seneca. So he is showing a difference with Hobbes here on this one. His most famous philosophical work, the Essay on Human Understanding, was published in 1689, and this is what he's most famous for in philosophy departments, and it's a focus on epistemology. He critiqued the idea of innate ideas, or that we are born with certain ideas already fully formed in our minds, and argued that all of our knowledge comes from empirical experience. This is the idea of empiricism. If you've heard of the idea of the mind as a blank slate that we write on with experience, that's John Locke's idea here. Outside of philosophy, he was both an advisor and a personal physician to Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Shaftesbury. He was the personal physician and eventually performed a surgery that saved the life of Shaftesbury, and served as a secretary of the Board of Trade and Plantations and secretary of the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, which helped shape his ideas on international trade and economics, and he contributed to the Constitution of Carolina, which we'll come back to in a second. Later in today's lecture when we discuss slavery. This document established the legal framework of the of the Carolina colony. Now, in 1683, he went into exile in the Netherlands because he was suspected of participating in the Rye House Plot of 1683, which is an attempt to murder King Charles II and his brother and heir James II. There's little proof that Locke was directly involved, but there are rumors surrounding his employer Shaftesbury that led him to flee with Shaftesbury to the Netherlands. During this time, he published the Letter Concerning Toleration in Latin. While he was in exile, he wrote it as a letter to Philip von Limbroch, and it was likely written between 1685 and 1686, and it defends a separation between civil authority, or political power, and ecclesiastical authority, or religious authority, again showing his difference with Hobbes here. The latter civil authority uses coercive force for the safety of bodies, while ecclesiastical authority uses persuasion to save men's souls. And so he argued against having a state religion and toleration within bounds of diverse religions, but what he actually means is diverse forms of Christianity. So we're reading today excerpts from the second treatise of government. So the first treatise of government is a critique of the works of Sir Robert Filmer, the author of Patriarchia. And in that work, Filmer defends the divine right of kings by arguing that this divine right flows from the original dominion that God gave to Adam in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. And here, Locke is targeting Filmer's form of absolutism based on the hereditary descent of kings from Adam, rather than Hobbes's absolutism, grounded in the social contract. He does disagree with Hobbes in the course of the argument, but Hobbes was not an important argument for absolutism at this time, as Hobbes' writings were widely rejected because of his supposed atheism. Filmer was both far more important and popular. Archival work, including the work done by Peter Laslett in the introduction to the Cambridge edition here, the Blue Book. If you read the lengthy introduction, especially these chapter 3 on periods of composition and chapter 4 on Locke and Hobbes, if this is something of interest to you, it reveals that the target was Filmer, not Hobbes. And archival work has actually revealed that Locke didn't even have a copy of Leviathan with him while he was writing the two treatises. So Locke's argument in the first treatise is that Filmer is philosophically incoherent based on a flawed reading of Scripture. And we get a basic, summary of this argument in our reading for today on page 267, in which he summarizes the first discourse. It having been shown in the foregoing discourse that Adam had neither a natural right of fatherhood or by positive donation from God any such authority over his children or dominion over the world. If he had, his heirs had no right to it. That if his heirs had, there being no law of nature, nor positive law of God that determines what is the right heir in all cases that may arise, the right succession, consequently bearing rule, that could have certainly been determining. And it is impossible now that rulers now on earth should make any benefit or derive any least shadow of authority from that which is held to be the fountain of all power, Adam's private dominion and paternal jurisdiction. So the two treatises themselves were published anonymously in 1689 and 1690, and it was originally thought to be written in 1689 as a post hoc justification of the Glorious Revolution, providing a philosophical defense of the Bill of Rights demanded by Parliament. And we'll see more of this when we read the second half of the second treatise on Wednesday. But more recent research, including done by Peter Laslett, has argued that this was actually probably composed between 1679 and 1680, or at least significant portions of it. So several years before the revolution actually happened. And so, if it is in fact the case that Locke was writing this piece well before the revolution, this makes this argument a very radical and seditious work of political theory, arguing for the overthrow of James II and the establishment of some form of parliamentary rule here. Additionally, Locke is often anachronistically referred to as the father of liberalism, and that he defended the rights of individuals, individual conscience, and private property. His influence on the Declaration of Independence is obvious. The rights of life, liberty, and property become Jefferson's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And many people in libertarian and conservative circles will refer to Locke in the context of classical liberalism. So that's all some background. If you need to pause this lecture, take a break, we're going to turn to Locke's account of the state of nature in just a moment. So the second treatise of government picks up in chapter 1 with Locke's kind of summary of his critique of Filmer that I just read. Again, Filmer argued that the divine right of kings was derived from humanity's natural state, an endowment of Adam in the Garden of Eden. And so if Filmer's argument is false, he writes that we must of necessity find out another rise of government, another original of political power, and another way of designing and knowing the persons who have it, and what Sir Robert F. hath taught us. That if there's some sort of, if Filmer's wrong, we need to have a better account of where political authority and what makes political authority legitimate. And so, in doing so, he argues that we have to first distinguish political power from other forms of power. And for Locke, political power is the right of making laws with the penalties of death and all other penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, of employing the force of community in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. So there's already some significant differences in the Locke's account of politics than Hobbes. The preservation of property isn't really a thing in Hobbes, only indirectly. And here again, the employing the force of the community in the execution of laws and the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury is read out of Hobbes. But this idea of the public good is not really explicit in Hobbes. You could indirectly argue that there's some sort of public good that occurs by preserving security, but Locke makes this explicit. So already we're seeing some differences here. Like Hobbes, however, Locke begins with the state of nature, which he describes as both a state of perfect freedom and a state of perfect equality on 269. In the state of nature, individuals are free to do what they like and are all born with the same advantages of nature, so that there's no natural subordination between individuals without the consent of each other. So again, taking a similar model as Hobbes, and very different from the kind of natural inequalities of the classical condition. However, Locke adds this extra wrinkle that this equality of men by nature, he draws on Richard Hooker here to suggest that this equality of men is the foundation of an obligation to mutual and love, and we get the great maxims of justice and charity. Hobbes, there's no justice in nature. Locke is already making space for a more conciliatory and peaceful and mutually beneficial state of nature than Hobbes could admit. And this becomes more clear in the next passage, where Locke says that there are limits to perfect liberty. Unlike Hobbes, for whom we have an unlimited liberty and an unlimited right in the state of nature, Locke argues that there is a law of nature that constrains our liberty. First, it means, and this is a passage on 270 and 271, that we are not at liberty to destroy ourselves, that we cannot destroy ourselves or submit to our own destruction. And the reason is that because we are all equal and independent, no one should harm each other, because we are ultimately all created by an omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, and all servants of one sovereign master, that we are God's property, and we cannot sell ourselves into the power of another. Therefore, we ought to preserve ourselves. We cannot quit our station willingly. We cannot commit suicide or consent to our own destruction. And when our own self-preservation does not conflict with this, we ought to preserve as much as possible the rest of mankind. And therefore, we must, unless it is to do justice to an offender, take away or impair the life or what tends to the preservation of life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So the law of nature is not simply that we should defend ourselves like it is for Hobbes, but that we should defend ourselves and respect the life, liberty, body, and property of other human beings to the extent, as much extent possible. So already we're seeing a more peaceful state of nature that is guided by nature's law. So who enforces the law of nature? Locke on page 271 argues that everyone does. And he argues that this is because when you violate the law of nature, when you threaten the life, liberty, or property of another human being, you're declaring yourself to live by another rule than that of reason and common equity. That you're ultimately declaring yourself against the whole species. And just like you can destroy something noxious to you, everyone has the right to punish the offender and execute the law of nature in order to preserve this. This means that everyone in the state of nature has the right to kill a murderer, just as you would kill a lion or tiger or savage beast, because they've declared themselves that they are unwilling to participate in normal human community. And later, on page 279 to 80, in this discussion of the state of war, in which we'll talk to you about more in a second, he even extends this to include that it is lawful for a man to kill a thief. Because the threat to one's property is an attempt to place them in a state of war, is an attempt to place someone under their absolute dominion and absolute power, and therefore that threat of violence has to be responded to with violence. Therefore, it is a justifiable self-defense to kill a thief in Locke's state of nature. So, on the one hand, the law of nature suggests that it is far more peaceful state of nature than Hobbes. But on the other hand, the fact that everyone has the right to execute the law of nature using deadly force suggests that it might not be as different or as more peaceful than Hobbes's account. So how do we know this law? Locke argues that it was so plain was it writ in the hearts of all mankind. And here we have a tension. Because this claim that the law of nature is obvious to all who but consult their own hearts and own minds comes into conflict with his critique of innate ideas and his empiricist philosophy, in which the idea here is that the human mind is a blank slate, that there's nothing written in our hearts or minds. So most of the scholarship says that this is just an irreconcilable tension, that there's no way to reconcile these competing views. More recent scholarship, such as Tully, a 1993 article by James Tully, and a 2013 article by John Baltus, argues that Locke is trying to inculcate and educate individuals so that the laws of nature become self-evident and obvious. They look at his writings on education and his writings on religion and argue that what Locke is actually trying to do is to make it look and appear like these things are self-evident and obvious, even though that they are the product of custom and habit and education and discipline and training. I'm happy to talk more about these things if you are interested in them. So, if the state of nature is governed by a law of nature, where does war come from? So the discussion of the state of war comes from what he discusses as the inconveniences of the state of nature. He describes it as a strange doctrine that in the state of nature everyone has executive power of the laws of nature. And he says that it's completely true that men are bad judges in their own cases, that self-love will make them partial to themselves and their friends, and that civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature, which must certainly be great, whereby men may be judges in their own cases. And so Locke is admitting that the state of nature is not a utopia. This is not an anarchist utopia. This is not a peace and love hippie commune. There are real limitations to this. However, this, unlike Hobbes, does not constitute a state of war. Locke restricts the state of war to a much more narrow conception. And for Locke, a state of war involves when some person has a sedate and settled upon design upon another man's life, or attempts to put another man into his absolute power. It's not simply that we naturally disagree and naturally have competing desires and therefore we're naturally at war with each other. It's only when someone is trying to restrict my freedom and liberty or take away my life. And it's it's much narrower conception in which my freedom or liberty are being violated. And when someone declares war on me, I can kill them, and this is the foundation of why I can kill a thief for Locke. And so Locke says there's a plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war. The state of nature is a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, where the state of war is enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction. And that is because the state of nature is one in which the law of nature means that we are all working for mutual assistance and preservation. We enter a state of war here when individuals violate the law of nature and try to take away my life, liberty, and property. But that is not a guaranteed outcome for Locke like it is for Hobbes. Or at least that's what Locke asserts. Now, you're free to disagree here, and I encourage you in your discussion post to talk about how if you disagree, explain why. But this is a key distinction here. And so who is the target? Who is Locke talking about in this discussion of the state of war? He's not talking about other people. This isn't Hobbes' war of all against all. His target is the absolute monarch who is trying to hold dominion over people's lives and property without their consent. That his account of the state of war is not to describe why we need a strong sovereign, but his account of the state of war is describing what happens when the sovereign violates the law of nature and tries to take away people's lives, liberty, and property without their consent. And we'll come back to that in the second half on Wednesday, because this will be the crucial justification for Locke's social contract. We're going to talk about Locke's account of slavery and property in just a second, but if you need to pause this video, take a break, come back to it, this would be a great time to do so. So how does slavery function in Locke's thought? He dedicates a short chapter after the state of war, chapter 4, it's only 2 pages to a conception of slavery. And this begins with this idea that our natural liberty, this freedom from absolute arbitrary power, is so necessary to and closely conjoined with a man's preservation that we cannot by compact or his own consent enslave oneself to anyone. That no one can willingly consent into slavery because it violates the laws of nature. That slavery, there's no such thing as natural slavery for Locke because we have natural equality, and you cannot consent to put yourself in the position of a slave according to this theory. The only legitimate form of slavery is when someone who declares war against another who has already violated the laws of nature and declared themselves to not be bound by them is then defeated, and the victor, the person who was wronged, the person who was threatened by the war, chooses to spare their life and enslave them rather than kill them. Because they have the right to kill a thief, if you defend yourself and disarm the thief, you can enslave them, because this is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Now this creates a tension, the target again is the absolute monarch. He's using the rhetoric of slavery to suggest here that what the monarch is doing is unjustly enslaving the people. That this is a rhetorical ploy to suggest that what the king is doing by restricting the rights of parliament to and imposing taxes and restricting liberty and taking the lives of and threatening the lives of the subjects is both a state of war and an unjust form of slavery. This is a rhetorical move here. Then it sets up a problematic tension in Locke's thought. Because from the perspective of Locke's thought, the universal equality and liberty means that there can't be any justification of racialized slavery. The Atlantic slave trade would not be justified under the argument given in the second treatise. These are not people who, the Atlantic slave trade is not of the kind of lawful, the state of war continued between the lawful conqueror and captive. That's just fundamentally not the case. So under Locke's thought, there would be no justified conception of slavery. He doesn't reference the actual practice of the Atlantic slave trade in his writing, and it doesn't inform his theory. And again, he's targeting the abuses of power, but he's still problematically using the language of slavery to try to rhetorically incite the English people. However, when we look at Locke's own life, he was an advisor, as I said earlier, he was an advisor to Lord Shaftesbury in the Carolina colony, and as such, he personally and financially benefited from the Atlantic slave trade. Also, as a contributor to the fundamental constitution of the Carolinas, he was at least responsible, if not for this exact quote, but contributing to the constitution that includes the language that every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves of what opinion or religion soever. So we have this tension. And in our 2008 article, Locke, Natural Law, New World Slavery, the political theorist James Farr kind of argues that how could Locke, a philosopher of such judgment, criticism, and reflection, live with such contradiction and be so guilty of immoral evasion of the consequences of his labors taken as a whole? But he did. A kink in his head, he partook of the madness of American slavery. He not only held a strange doctrine, he was strangely indifferent to the contradiction in so grave a matter, and worse, to the lives and liberties of the persons made slaves in the New World. That Locke's thought does not justify the Atlantic slave trade, and in fact, antebellum slavery apologists turned to Aristotle, as we saw in our discussion of Aristotle, because they actually rejected Locke's claims for natural equality, and it was the abolitionists who looked to Locke's arguments about natural equality and natural liberty to argue against slavery. But Locke the person, in contrast to Locke the thinker, personally and financially benefited from the slave trade, suggesting that he either was able to overlook this contradiction or hadn't considered it. And while this isn't necessarily a damning indictment of his theory, it does raise questions to kind of what the rhetoric of slavery is doing here and doing for Locke, and how he's kind of unreflectively using this rhetoric of slavery, using this image of slavery to invoke a political revolution, but not applying that to actual instances of slavery. So it should give us pause, and I invite you to kind of think about how this makes you read his discussion of slavery and property in the state of war and the social contract going forward. The last thing we're going to talk about today is Locke's account of property, which is one of the more distinctive aspects of Locke's thought. And it's probably the first time that we really see a theory of property being developed in the text that we've studied. So, again, in contrast to Filmer, God gives the earth not to Adam and his heirs, but to human beings in common. The question then is how men might come to have property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of all the commoners. If the earth is given to us all to share for our common benefit, why am I allowed to put a fence around some of it, claim it as mine, and then charge people the right to use it? And this is the challenge here that Locke is trying to show, that God, who hath given the world and men in common, has also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. So Locke is trying to say that we are to benefit from this common property. And he's trying to give us an account of private property from this idea that we are to benefit from the earth. And he develops what's known as a labor theory of value. And it begins with the idea that labor, like the use of our bodies and our hands, is an extension of our life power, and it's an extension of our life. It's us using part of our life and energy to make something, and therefore it's entirely our own property. The labor is entirely our own property. Now, when we mix our labor with something, when we chop down a tree, turn it into wood and carve and use it to construct a house or a chair or a table, we are adding value to that. We are mixing our labor and adding value to that nature. We are transforming something, and because we are putting part of our life, literally part of our lifetime and life force into that thing, that which we mixed our labor becomes our property. And for Locke, this includes the work of tools, animals, and servants. So if he says like the same thing, if you hammer something or if you use a tool, it's yours. If your animal tilled the soil, it's yours. Or if your servant, harvested the apples from the apple tree, they're your apples. And he also argues later in this chapter that about 99% of the value of things comes from the labor added to them, not their raw state. So the property is justified because while God gave the world to the men in common, he gave it to them for their benefit, and the greatest conveniences of life they were capable to draw from it. And so therefore it cannot be supposed that he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. He gave it to the industrious and rational, not to the fancy and to the or covetousness of the quarrelsome and contentious. that God gave us the earth in common, but he wanted us to be industrious and rational with it. He wanted us to make use of the earth for our own benefit and to the benefit of all of humankind. Therefore, he doesn't want us just to leave it barren and leave it uncultivated. He wants us to transform forests into timber. He wants us to transform empty land into agricultural land for Locke. That Locke believes that God wants us to be industrious and rational. However, there are significant limits to property. Locke does not believe that this is an unlimited right to property. He adds two provisos here. On page 90, he introduces the spoilage proviso, that we have a right to as much of the commons as we can make use of before it spoils. Right? That if we're gathering so many apples from the apple orchard that we can't eat them all, and the apples start spoiling, then we're literally wasting and robbing other people. That any waste that we have is robbing other people of the means of their own subsistence, and therefore we are stealing from them, and that is bad. Similarly, we can take as much from the earth as that we leave still enough and as good left. And this is the as much and as good proviso, that we have to leave enough for everyone else to have some. So these are built-in natural limits to how much property you acquire. They create limits to the amount of inequality that labor can create. However, money undermines these natural limits for Locke. That this rule of propriety, in which every man should have as much as he could make use of, would hold still in the world without straitening anybody, since there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put value on it, introduced by consent larger possessions and a right to them. Money doesn't spoil, as he writes on page 300, and so it does not. You can acquire more than you would use and then trade it for money. And by doing so, we've ended up consenting to the value of that money, the value of those coins of gold and silver that have no value in and of themselves. And therefore, it allows you to gain access to more wealth and power. And for Locke, this is the root of inequality, as he writes on page 302, that men have agreed to a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth, they having, by a tacit and voluntary consent, found out a way how a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of, by receiving in exchange for the overplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone, these metals not spoiling or decaying in the hands of the possessor. And so this also raises a question of interpretation. Many more Marxist-influenced theorists are very critical of Locke on this account, saying that he's debating for unlimited acquisition, massive amounts of inequality. This was made famous in C.B. Macpherson's 1962 book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, that basically argued that Locke and Hobbes set the grounds for capitalist expansion and massive amounts of inequality. More recent research done by people like Stephen Keltz and David Williams have argued the inverse, that what Locke is doing here isn't necessarily praising money, that he's actually telling a tragic story here, that with the introduction of without money, we have natural limits to inequality that we all would have had enough to survive, and we would have been equal, and we would have been much closer to nature. But it is only with the creation of money that this natural limits become undermined, and you have massive amounts of inequality and therefore poverty. And so I'll leave it for you to think through which of these accounts you find more persuasive. But there's two ways of reading these passages, like whether they are kind of, look, these are justified because men have consented to them, or that this is a tragic story. So what's the point of this discussion of property? For Locke, the idea here is again that seizure of property without consent is seizing the means and extensions of one's life without their consent. That this is placing someone in a state of war with you. So the king seizing the property of his subjects without the consent of parliament places him in a state of war with them. The king is violating the laws of nature, and as we will see in the next passages that we will read for Wednesday on the beginning of political societies and the social contract, that this justifies the dissolution of the political community and the foundation of a new form of government. In essence, Locke's defense of property is part of what he uses to justify revolution. So next class, we're going to look at Locke's account of political authority in the second half of the second treatise, looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9, and portions of 18 and 19. And while you're reading this, how does Locke's social contract similar to and different from Hobbes's? Now for your discussion thread, again, everyone must write 1 200-word response to either today's discussion post or Wednesday's discussion question by the end of the week, by Friday at midnight. And everyone has to respond to a peer's post with a 100-word reply by Sunday at midnight. So, what is the most significant similarity between Hobbes and Locke's conception of the state of nature? What is the most significant difference? What do you think explains this difference? And so that is where we will end today. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions about Locke, tune into the discussions section on Wednesday afternoon. Stop by in office hours. Send me an email. If you're having any trouble accessing the materials or accessing these lectures, please let me know, and I will find a way to make them available to you in a more accessible means. As always, take care of yourself, stay healthy, focus on what's important, and I will see you next class. Take care.